Welcome to Module 7.3. In this module, we're going to be talking about macros, which are little programs inside Excel that let us automate repetitive tasks and combined with other features can be extremely powerful. So let's take a look at an example. Here I have a macro recorded in the background that takes a number or any cell and changes the background color, changes the foreground color, changes the font and size. So simply by selecting them, I could press my keyboard shortcut and it will automatically apply a whole bunch of different rules automatically. Okay, so I could just pick the cells, press the keyboard shortcut, and it happens by itself. I'll give you a very quick overview of how I made this macro, and then we could take a look at some of the other uses for it. So I'm going to go to a normal cell, and I'm going to click record down at the bottom, and it's going to say this macro number 6, and the shortcut will make Control W. I'll press OK. Now it's a black square, so that means it's recording, and we'll make the color, the font color will make bright red, and the background will make bright blue. Hard to see, but maybe a little lighter will work better. There we go. Okay, so that's the change that's going to happen. We could also do things like change the font size, and we could also change the font type. Okay, and that's it. I'll press stop. And now when I go to anywhere in the workbook, it doesn't even have to be on this sheet, and I press Control W, it should change based on, it didn't pick up all the changes it seems. We'll have to go through and see what did and what didn't, but it copies over, it's going with Arial instead of Blackadder. Interesting. So we'd have to go through it and see why it changed to Arial. Maybe because it was already changed. Let's try this one. No, I'm not sure. We would have to go through and play around with it. But that's the idea, that using that program in the background, we created a shortcut to change the font, foreground, background color, etc. Okay, so in this chapter, we're going to look at how to create these macros and the different features of what they can do. And we'll also take a look at creating buttons that you press the button instead of the keyboard shortcut to run the macro for you. And we're going to start on page 426, and we'll take a look first at the macro button. So you see there's one down here. To click this, it starts a macro recording. There's also this developer button up here. And under the developer button, which you can see on page 427, I have a macro button here, which shows the macros I've already created. And it also lets me open up a macro and run it. Okay, I'm also able to change around the macros. So I'm going to delete those for now. We'll start at the beginning. If you don't have this, and if you have a new copy of Excel, you probably won't, you have to enable the developer button to see the macros. We could also use macro record, and we're going to talk about security later in the module. So to get here, you want to go into customize the ribbon. And under customize, you might have developer on this side. You have to check it and move it over to this side and make sure that it's checked. Okay, so once you have that, then we'll be able to see the macro button under developer, under code. Okay, so macros basically run lines of code on your copy of Excel on your computer. And it's a very powerful tool, but it could also create computer viruses, and it could do things that you don't intend. If you click on macro security, you'll see some of the options that you can see in figure 731 on page 429, and look at different options for creating macros and running that code when you send it to somebody else. Macros could be problematic because if I send you a macro file, which is saved as .xlsxm, when the person opens it, they're going to get a warning saying this file contains a macro. Are you sure you want to open it? So depending on our security level, that could impact if they're even able to open it on their computer. Okay, so the code for a macro is saved in Visual Basic, which is VBA, and it's basically a series of commands that you could either type in manually or you could record it with the keyboard as I did earlier. Now, you could also create a separate file for your Visual Basic plugin, which will have just the macro by itself. Okay, so let's take a look at the example from the text. All right, so let's take a look at the example, winter example from the textbook. And you'll note that there's actually another file. I believe it's in the module folder under Excel 7. And basically the idea is that we fill the registration up here at the top. It copies into our form as we did before, and then it transfers to our registration data page using a macro. So I'm going to open up the completed version of that, and here it says as soon as I open it, warning, macros have been disabled, enable content. So that's turned off right away because it's going to run this extra code that it's not sure what it is exactly. So I'm going to press enable content, and now the macros are active. Okay, so for this form, it asks me to fill out the registration date, the youth name, activity, and so on. And then over here, I also have what size shirt, the youth information, and so on. Once I fill this out, I press transfer data, and it copies the information down here into my receipt, and it also copies it here onto the next sheet. I've done it a couple times, so it keeps on repeating over and over again. But basically, every time I print out a receipt and I press transfer data, it saves it onto the next sheet, right? If I press create PDF, it almost worked. But the idea is that it will run in the built-in PDF printer and print a PDF of this receipt, which doesn't look like it came from Excel. It's nicely formatted. So like we looked at, if the My PDF print button is not installed properly, because I don't have the drivers set up for it, but if it works, then this is what it would look like. It would print out a PDF receipt, which basically takes all the data from this field and puts it into the PDF. Okay, so you could see how to run a macro, create the transfer data macro, and take a look at the Visual Basic Editor to see the code behind the macro on pages 437 to 445 or 444. And next we're going to take a look at how to create a macro button. Okay, so let's make a macro, and I'll show you the difference between relative and absolute references. So let's say we put in a number. Okay, I'll put in 19,998. Okay, and we want the macro to run on the cell next to it. Now it doesn't matter if it's exactly in B7, it could be over here in I15. It doesn't really matter, we just want it to go next to it. So I'm going to press where it says use relative reference, and I'm going to press record macro. It's going to say it's called macro number 2, and what do you want to make happen? I'm going to press Control P to make it run, and now the macro is recording. So I'm going to go to the cell next to it, and I'm going to say equals this cell multiplied by 5.25. Okay, but I could use any formula to do that. And now I'll press stop macro. We could go into macros and see a list of macros. We could also press edit and take a look at what exactly the macro does. You'll see here it says active cell offset by 1, range, it will take it and multiply it by 5.25. Right, as you can see right here. This is basically what macro 2 will actually do. Okay, so now that our macro is recorded, we just have to press Control P to do it. So if we have a number, doesn't matter where the number is, and we go to the cell next to it, we click on the cell, we press Control P, and the number will show up next to it. And because we're using relative references, it knows to put that formula into the cell to the right of it. Right? We could also make it go to the right, down, up. We could do multiple combinations. It all depends. It's based off of where our initial cell is. Right? If we did this number and we press Control P, it would then multiply by 5.25, the number next to it. And like I said, we could do multiple formulas. We could create many different steps in one macro to become automated. Okay, so for another example, I set up a macro that if I click on a number and I press Control K, whoops, hold on, there we go. Okay, so basically, there you go. I set up a macro that if I click on the space next to the number and I press Control K, it will automatically go and put in the payment function with the interest rate, the number of payments, and it will use the cell next to it as the number. So imagine you had a whole list of numbers and you selectively wanted to just go in and figure out what the monthly payment would be. This would do it for you automatically instead of having to go and type in the formula. Okay, so it makes it a lot faster. And if we use any set of random numbers, it will do the same thing, using those same pre-programmed variables. So for example, I could have control K is 5.5% interest, control L would be 6.5% interest, control J would be a different interest rate, and then depending on that shortcut that I press, it will automatically put in the formula or perform a number of calculations. And we could do a whole bunch of calculations, one after another, by nesting formulas and using a macro. We can see what macros we already have if we click on macros under developer, and we click on where it says options, and this will say for macro 3 we run it by pressing Control K. But we can certainly either run it, or we can go to edit, or we can look at step info and see what exactly it does. Right, so right here it will say that it applies this formula on the cell next to the cell. It says it's offset by 1. Okay, so here you can see it says this is what the formula is doing, and this is saying the cell offset, it says by 1. So we could define the cell offset to happen below, above. We could actually do multiple formulas with many different steps in order to find out what's going on. Okay, so I'll do one more example of that, and then we'll get to buttons. So here we have, let's say, the number $25, and we want to add tax. So I'm going to click on the 25, I'll start record, and for this macro, we'll do Control D. Okay, so first we will take the number and multiply it by 1.13, and then we'll take this number and deduct our initial, so we see how much tax there is. We see what the total including the 13% is. Okay, and then we could take our total number and multiply it by 1.15 to get the total plus 15% tip, and then we could take this number and subtract our original, okay, just to give you an idea. So then we press stop, and now the macro is ready to run. Okay, so if I have a list of prices, all I have to do is click on it and press Control D, and it's going to automatically carry out all the steps that we did before in 1 second. Right? So we can then go in and change it to only have, let's say, 2 decimal places. Okay, and then we would get all the same steps that we did above in 1 step just by pressing Control D based on that original number. Just like that. Okay, so next let's take a look at how we can automate this process by using a button. Okay, so I created a button called Tax and Tip, and let's go through the process of doing that. So I go back to Developer under Controls, and I press Insert Button. It's the first one that comes up. I'm going to draw the button, and it's going to say what macro do you want to assign to it. So I'm going to say macro 4, which is the same as pressing Control D. And I just go into the title, and I'm going to rename it Tax and Tip. Okay, so all I'll do is I'll have my numbers like we had before, and I just go to the first one, I click Tax and Tip, and it will do the calculation for me automatically. So instead of having to remember which shortcut for the macro goes with which, I could just assign that function to a button, put the button onto the page, and then have it carry out those calculations or formulas automatically based on whatever value I have in the first cell. Okay, so here it's going through all the same steps that we had before, multiplying by 1.13, subtracting one from the other, multiplying it by 1.15, and then subtracting one from the last. So it really just depends how you want the button to look, where you want it to be positioned, but it's a great way to have a set of controls inside the document, which allows you to just press a button and have something carried out. So in the textbook example, it's about data transfer, but there's also many other uses for it. Now you'll notice that when I try to save this file, Right now, I tried to save it as session 7.3-2. It says it can't be saved because it has VB project. It basically has macros in it, so it won't let us save it as a normal file. To save with these file features, choose a macro-enabled file type. So to do that, we click here and we go to the next one, which is called SLXSM. We pick that one, and it says macro-enabled workbook. Then it's going to let us save the file. Okay, so when you do that, it will now save it with the extension that's macro-enabled. It ends with an M, and then we'll be able to save it. Now, when we try to open this file, we're also going to get a security warning. Okay, now you can't select the button directly because if you click on it normally with a left-hand click, it'll just run the code. So instead, you right-hand click on it, and then you're able to edit the text on the button, grouping, and you could assign a different macro. Okay, so you could pick a different macro and basically have it do a different function depending on what you have it assigned to. You could also go to Format Control and change the way that the button looks. You could also go up to Drawing Tools and change many of the features to make the button appear differently. You can make it round, you can make it have different colors, and so on. Okay, so you can play around with the buttons by going to Insert Button and assigning the one that you draw to a particular macro. You could create a number of different macros, and you can go through the steps in here as well as create new ones using both absolute and relative references, and create buttons inside your sheet to make it easier for users to run calculations or to carry out functions like saving and exporting data. Okay, so that wraps it up for session 7.3. Next, we'll start with session 8. Thank you.